Hi, I'm Ozzie Hall. Welcome to Critical Race Issues Forum. Today I want to talk to you about David Walker. David Walker is an important uh, African American historical character that in 1829 published a document called David Walker's Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. And his appeal was so controversial that many state legislatures um, passed laws to ban it. And there were a group of people who were intent on killing him for publishing his thoughts. David Walker was a free African American. His mother was free. His father was a slave, and he became free, and he moved to Boston, where he operated a clothing store, a business. But he was a outspoken abolitionist, and he had traveled all over the United States. And he made the observation that after having traveled all over the United States, he observed that the conditions of Black people across this country, and particularly in the South, was worse than the conditions of slavery of any nation that has existed in the history of mankind. He referred to those other nations as so-called heathen nations as compared to a so-called enlightened Christian nation, and what the so-called enlightened Christian nation was doing to other human beings. And he vehemently protested it in his document, an appeal to Black people to rise up against slavery. And he published this about 3 years after the death of Thomas Jefferson. Now, Thomas Jefferson, although he had a secret Black family, had made a number of public statements about the inferiority of Black people. And these public statements were being used by those people who advocated to maintain slavery, particularly in the South. And so David Walker spoke out and pushed back against those thoughts and ideals that were presented by Thomas Jefferson. And of course, David Walker died a year later. And the fact of the matter is that his writing had a substantial impact upon the consciousness of America. His famous appeal was republished in 1848 by Henry Highland Garnett and became a very critical piece in terms of the thinking and the moving forward in consciousness toward the Civil War and the ending of slavery. David Walker's role in American history is a critical role that should be discussed. It should not be swept under the rug. Yet we don't hear about it in the public school system, whether it's elementary school, middle school, or high school. It's never discussed. And it's very often not even discussed in college, very rarely. So the reality is that when we look at this issue of critical race, it's extremely important that we learn about David Walker, that we talk about David Walker, that we share his ideals, his thoughts. You have so many people now promoting the concept to say, well, you know, slavery was kind of an institution of its time, and everybody was doing it, and it was normal at the time, and you know, it wasn't so bad. But David Walker, a contemporary of that time, talks about what it was then, and he talks about the fact that in comparison to other nations and what was going on in the world at the time and prior, that it was the worst condition that has ever existed in the history of mankind. And so I think this is critical because early on, this thought that slavery was somehow benign and that, you know, it was normal at the times, that idea was rejected during the time of slavery by David Walker, who was a man who had educated himself, had traveled, and who was aware of the history of many other nations, and who had done a substantial amount of study before he wrote and before he even spoke. And so I think that his ideals have a critical role in the history of the United States, and his published document is an extremely important piece of African American literature that should be studied, that should be discussed, that should be talked about, that should be presented in a public forum. And so I'm sharing this information because I believe that by talking about David Walker and what he believed, it helps us to gain an understanding of the impact that slavery had at the time from someone who was observing it happening, that was right there. And it refutes many of the people that have come forward in modern times to try to act as if, you know, slavery was a normal thing. So David Walker, an extremely important historical character at the beginning, at the founding, you know, the first critical years of the development of the United States, and in this discussion about critical race issues.